We first met Sven Pihl, watched him, in fact, at a number of NOFA conferences where he was always deep in conversation with people, um, not necessarily making formal presentations, but really talking to people. And now we understand, knowing him a little bit better, how committed he is to showing people what they can do with their land to make it productive of food and simply healthier. Sven has a company called Connecticut Edibles, and you'll see a link to that in his own slideshow. He's a regenerative land planner and a permaculture educator based in Connecticut, but definitely talks to people elsewhere. And he designs multifunctional edible landscapes, gardens for homes, commercial properties, campuses, public spaces. And he's interested in how all of this also helps towards people localizing their food systems. He began in this area with the financial crash of 2008, homesteading and developing his own homestead. He's also a veteran and part of a group called Farmer Veterans. He has a very interesting trajectory in how he has learned the skills that he wants to share with people. And I think you will enjoy what he has to say. So without further ado, here is Sven.
Good morning, everyone. How is everybody? I'm just trying to navigate sharing screen and all that fun stuff. So my business name is Connecticut Edible Ecosystems. I'm presenting today on edible landscaping. Generally through the permaculture realm, I design differently than this, but see, we'll see in the presentation how aesthetically pleasing an edible landscape can be. And this is primarily using material from Charlie Nardozzi and Rosalind Creasy. They both have books out. Charlie's is Foodscaping, Rosalind Creasy's is Edible Landscaping. Let me try to figure out how to share the screen. So the majority of the work presented here, I put hyperlinks at the bottom as to where I obtained the material from, out of respect for those that have created said material. So we see right here, there's a beautiful edible garden with kale and other brassicas and so on in it. If we're looking at edible landscaping from the aesthetic side, this is basically it. I work primarily from the production side and the ecosystem benefit side, carbon sequestration, pollinators, food production, water management, all of that in the same general realm. My workshop coming up this afternoon will touch more on the permaculture practices and tools and systems that I use to design landscapes that I work on. And I believe that the thought process that comes through permaculture is perfect for this. And so I guess let's begin. And before we begin, I'm trying to scroll. There we go. Before we begin, I'd like to honor the Quinnipiac peoples whose land I currently live on and am presenting from. We are all on stolen land and should keep this in mind. Okay, there we go. My forwarding is not working. So today I'm going to cover in this presentation food and landscaping history. What is edible landscaping? What are the types of edible landscaping? I'm not so much going to go into annual plants and perennial plants. That's a whole nother realm, and that basically comes from the distillation of the scale of permanence, which I will work through in the workshop this afternoon. Okay, I'm gonna have to, there we go. Okay, edible landscaping is the use of food-producing plants in a residential landscape. It combines fruit and nut trees, berry bushes, vegetables, herbs, edible flowers, along with ornamental plants into aesthetically pleasing designs. These designs can adopt any garden style and may include anywhere from 1 to 100% edible species. Okay, excellent. Rosalind Creasy writes, the first gardens, of course, were motivated by survival, not aesthetics. We've generally moved into the realm of aesthetics. I'm not necessarily the most pleased by such because we're not taking into account historically pollinators, wildlife, our own nutritional needs, and I also live in the bedding plant capital of the world. So, you know, it's all about yews under the dining room window and hostas and other plants. But I think we can move back or find a middle ground, and that's what edible landscaping is to me. So agriculture began, I have this. Agriculture began in the Zagros mountain range on the border of Iran and Iraq, often called the Fertile Crescent. And scientists had long assumed that these early farmers were a homogeneous group that traded and intermingled, swapping farming tools and tricks. But basically, it's also, there are different groups of people moving from hunting, gathering, foraging to agriculture across the world. New studies are showing that multiple groups of people in the Fertile Crescent started agriculture, and these groups were generally distinct from one another. They didn't intermingle at the time, and at least not for a few thousand years. They lived more or less in a similar area, but they stayed isolated from each other. And these are still getting messed up. So some of my notes continue to, every time I save the file, things get readjusted. So this is an image of an Egyptian garden around 1400 BC. And tomb paintings depict well-to-do Egyptians. Well-to-do is a key word there, and it shows us privilege. So well-to-do Egyptians, where was I? With pools of fish, grape-covered trellises, flower beds, fruits like figs, pomegranates, and dates. The Persians perfected on this by using geometrical design that invited outdoor entertainment. Those that adopted these practices were Indians and the Moors, and then the Romans. Geez, everything's getting cut off. In the medieval era, after the fall of Rome in 400 AD, villa-style gardens disappeared only to reappear, with Christian monasteries with gardens basically in the same style. Common practices included grafting fruit trees, raised beds, and what we see today with fish ponds. I wanted to look into a little bit further the grafting process or the history. And I know I've seen history from Asia, I believe China, that goes way back as well with their grafting practices, but then that gets into some of the really geeky technical aspects of this, and we don't have the time in this presentation for it. The pastoral landscape came up next. In the early 1700s, it was a reaction against the controlled look, which means man manipulating nature, with influence from China, with influence from Asia, prompted by the English to develop a softer, more informal view of landscaping. And then we've got our European edible gardens from the 1700s to the 1900s, where French gardeners were more practical and developed gardens that were both decorative and functional, and vegetables were interplanted with flowers in geometrical shapes that lined with boxwoods and espaliered fruit trees. So what we're basically seeing is privilege and affluence intermixing aesthetically pleasing plants with food production. And I don't know truly what the amount of food that came out of these systems was, I didn't see any information on that. And here's an early American garden recreation in Virginia. Colonist priority was survival, so went back to growing edible plants brought from Europe, and they later appropriated the growing of corn, beans, and squash from indigenous peoples. But we see how we went from the aesthetic side back to function again and production. I wanted to also note that there were entire civilizations with ecologically based practices, such as those living in the Amazon River Basin, where it has been found, where they have found 4,500-year-old food forests that were in production at that time, and at times still to today. And that's based upon the way plants are spread. And there's also a 2,000-year-old Moroccan food forest discovered in the 70s that's still in production and feeds upwards of 800 families. So I'm basically just trying to share different peoples at different times have put together different practices for food production. And it's primarily through affluence and privilege that some were able to intermix aesthetics, and some systems are pure function for survival. So this is an image of the food forest in Inra-Ren, Morocco, that feeds that 800 families. So this is not the right slide. Uh-oh, what's going on? Something's going on here. 1 second, let me just. Darn it. Now a bunch of slides aren't showing up for some reason. My apologies, everyone. Let me try to fix this again. Okay, so basically what I have found is edible landscaping, especially through Rosalind Creasy, has been broken up into different categories. So we've got container gardening. We've got, let me just find a pretty slide to look at. We've got islands. So that would be like in between pathways, kind of like this image that's being shown right now. Foundation plantings, so that could be like one would use boxwoods or yews along a fence or their home. Blueberries or raspberries or other perennials of that nature would be planted along a foundation. Just trying to think of some other methods. One of the things that's definitely taken into account, and we can look back at slide. Geez. So here we've got this beautiful purple kale. I believe this would be a dinosaur kale. I can't really see it that well on the small image. Some collards or cabbage. And we've got some flowers, marigolds, and some other plants in here that are very aesthetically pleasing. These look like hostas here. And they can be intermixed. So one of the main things with this, and again, it comes down to aesthetics, is working with a color palette and intermixing plants that stand out pretty strongly against each other based upon their colors. I would say one of the difficult aspects of this type of practice is basically in the design itself, understanding how these colors work together or don't, and using that in the design process. That is actually something I have not seen as much of in this practice. So it seems like it's a subset of the practice, probably more on taking the professional level landscape design and all the aesthetics aspects of that and applying that to annual and perennial plants. In my designs, I would do something of this nature where the understory plantings on the ground would be pollinator plants, other food producing plants, dynamic accumulators, plants with deep tap roots that bring those nutrients up in their leaves. And then when that plant sheds its leaves, or when those plants are cut, those leaves are placed back on the ground, the leaves decompose and percolate back in the soil. So you're basically mining nutrients from well below the soil level, or the surface level, back up to the surface level, and then allowing it to percolate back in. There'd be pest confusers, plants that would deter, let's say in this case with all these brassicas, a plant that would deter those cabbage moths and other plants of that, other insects like that. Here we would have, looking at the architecture or the multi-strata aspect of this planting, we have a tree. This could very easily be a fruit tree. One of the issues with that is you'd want to ensure you have access to the tree, and that anything to the north, let's say if the sun is out this way, anything to the north would have to be, or should be, more shade tolerant due to the canopy of the tree. So we're looking at this three-dimensionally, and also in understanding basically shade patterns, light and shade patterns, understanding the three-dimensional, or I can't remember what axis now, the height of something, how far it casts its shade. And a lot more of this is going to come up in the workshop later. I'm trying to think of what else to add to this. I would say the best bet is to look through seed catalogs, Johnny's, Baker Creek, Fruition Seeds, others, and look at the images of the plants. So there's a image, I believe it's called Garden of Eden, out of England. It's got beautiful rows of different plants. There's alliums, I believe there's some type of onion, and brassicas, say it's kale, in just these linear rows. So one of the issues with that is you're putting a plant that's the same type of plant next to a plant I'm repeating myself, but that is the same. That makes it very easy for insects to move from one space or from one plant to the plant right next to it. So I would say referring to companion planting guides, as well as the aesthetics of these plants and the nutritional benefits and all that, would be very important to have a healthy garden. Soil health is so incredibly important. I use the Bionutrient Food Association, Dan Kittredge's entity, based out of Massachusetts, but pretty much spread across the country now. So basically, I take a soil sample, I send it out to Logan Labs. They give me back the results of the soil test. I then go to enter that information into Organic Calc, which is a subscription-based service. That gives me better numbers on what I need. And again, a lot of this is tied to agriculture, not necessarily home use. And then that has to get all broken up into like square footage and the amount of amendments that should go in the soil. So the goal there is to have your soil be as healthy as it can be, to provide that health to the plants, which then becomes your health. Let me see. And so I get my nutrients, or I work with the Bionutrient Food Association on that. I'll send them the information I receive from Logan and Organic Calc, have folks there analyze that. There's some changes they've made. Rock dust is one of the main things in there. And we want to pay attention too to the fact that 40 to 70% of the nutrients in our farmland soil have been depleted and they're not being put back. And if we look at it as vegetables mining nutrients from soil, and I say mining because that matter, that vegetable mass, does not make it back into that soil. It makes it into people who then put their waste into the sewage system. That gets treated, and then water goes elsewhere. But those nutrients have to be replaced, or else we're not going to get that in our food. We can do that in our landscapes. Some farms I know are doing that, but not that many yet. Another thing we want to pay attention to, and especially with our leafy greens, and is basically lead contamination. So it's recommended that leafy greens do not get planted along the foundation of a house out to about 20 feet due to the lead from the paint over years accumulating in the soil. It affects young people mostly, or lead poisoning does. But so gardens that have leafy greens like these should not be placed directly at the foundation of a home. 20 feet out is recommended. Lead tests are not expensive. That can be done as well. Your fruiting plants, much like, and I'm not a scientist, I'm more of a researcher. Fruiting plants supposedly do not uptake lead like vegetative plants. And like a mammal, because their fruit is the housing or the food for its offspring, which is the seed, the mother plant is protecting its offspring by storing the lead in her body rather than passing it on to the fruit, which is the food for the seed. So I do plant fruiting plants within that 20 feet, but I generally do not plant leafy greens. That can be mitigated too through raised beds, amending soil, basically digging out soil and bringing soil back. But the issue there also is dust. I'm trying to think, what else can I add to that? A lot more comes up on the design side in the later workshop. We're actually really we're going to be walking through the scale of permanence and the step-by-step on how to do a site analysis and the process for design, which will feed a lot more into what should get where, what should go where. And hopefully by then I'll have fixed my technical difficulties. How much longer do we have? Adam?
I think you have about 5 more minutes.
Okay.
Yeah, about 5 to 10 minutes, and then 10 to 15 minutes of questions.
Okay. Is there anything in the chat at the moment that I could answer?
Well, couple of questions.
Okay.
How can root systems interactions be taken into account is one question.
Okay.
And another question is, could you briefly share what the principles are of edible landscaping?
Okay. So root systems, I would say that comes, we would really want to look at, and that actually brings up another thought, but we want to look at the companion planting guide. A lot of that is above ground on how plants interact, but I believe it's also tied to underground, because the way plants grow, and hopefully I'm not mentioning something too basic, is you have sunlight working with a plant's leaves, and it creates sugars, and those sugars are then pumped into the soil by the roots. Those sugars then feed bacteria and other life in the soil, and then that bacteria and so on, it lives, it dies, it goes to the bathroom, it does all of that. It breaks down nutrients in the soil along with fungus, and then the roots take that back up, turn some of that into carbohydrates, which go back up into the leaves, and that cycle continues, and some of it goes into the building blocks of the plant itself. So we can look at, like, when we tap maple trees, that's literally that carbohydrate pulmonary system of the maple tree going from and it also acts as a an antifreeze. But that's moving around that tree regularly. That tree's putting that stuff into the soil to feed bacteria, which, as I mentioned, feeds life in the soil, which in turn feeds the plant. So a lot of this is in cycles. I wouldn't worry so much. Well, I would say definitely look at companion planting guides. That's probably the best bet for understanding root systems. But that also had me thinking about like call before you dig and other practices. Where's your septic system? I personally don't have an issue with growing over a septic system unless I have to. And I wouldn't do this for a client per se, unless I had like some very, very clear conversations with them. But you want to know where what is underground on your site, because say this tree that's in the image, that could very easily clog up aspects of your leach field and so on and so forth. And I wouldn't suggest planting trees, but shallow rooted plants over a septic system, I personally would do, because I'm basically providing them free food. I won't be, I mean, I might pay more attention to root crops, but and their proximity to human waste. But the way I look at it generally is that that waste is feeding the soil, which then feeds the plants. And I've seen, you can see it if you look at somebody's yard, these stripes and the height of grass, or how fast the grass is growing, if it's growing over a leach field. And so if it's feeding that grass just fine, why not have it feed my vegetables? And I've also, there's a composting operation in Haiti. There are some Yale students were working down there, and they basically developed a municipal, like kind of a porta potty type system over a 55-gallon drum that was collected, composted, and then applied back to the fields. I would say it's a bit different than using Milorganite, which is made from municipal sewage waste. That's something I don't use in gardens. I generally follow organic standards, and Milorganite is different. Plus, a lot of people in other countries do not take the quantities of medicine and things like that we do. So that can become an issue. What was the other question again?
There's a few questions.
The principles of edible landscaping.
So the way I'm looking at it, from what I understand, and this is kind of combining practices, is truly what is the client's goals? What is the landowner's goal? And for that to be created, and I'll get a little bit more into goals in the later workshop, but for that to be created is truly like, what do you want? How do you want to live your life? How do you want to be seen by your neighbors? So some of this comes out of like the lady before me was presenting holistic management with goal setting there. This comes from permaculture and landscape design with goal setting. And the hard part with this is we're not actually taught this. We're taught, in a sense, something different. Like, what do you want to be when you grow up? Is not, I mean, it's a question that's asked, but there's no development of that thought process through our growing up. So that tends to be a very difficult aspect in working with clients. So I'm going to get into that again a little bit later, but it's true. I think it's, how much of your yard do you want to eat from? And so I'd look at, there's different tables and so on for how much food to grow per person in a household. I would say, just pretend it's 6 tomato plants for 4 people. I'm making this up. I'm not looking at it right now. I tend to use a lot of references. And but if you're canning and preserving, you're probably going to want more. And then that's just one vegetable, but we can look at I would suggest to look at the whole list. And now then maybe apply that quantity those quantities of vegetables to, let's say, square foot gardening. That's another book. I can't remember the author. 1 second. I have it out here on the table or desk somewhere. But square foot gardening, I think, is an excellent reference for somebody that's starting. And it gives you generally pretty decent references as to how many plants per square foot. Then one can take the visual aspect of that plant in context to, 1 tomato plant per square foot, and things like that, and develop and apply that to a scale version of their yard. And basically you're just taking, images or dots or circles or whatever, and placing them next to each other to create basically something that, like you see in the image there. And that was some of the difficulty I ran into in looking through the material for this, was having to bounce around from one book or manual to another. That I'm hoping I'm answering that question. It really, I still go, I mean, I've been at this for 12 years now, and I use my references. They are so important. And over the years, I've found better ones than others, but none of this, if you're going to do it right, it's formulaic. It's not cookie cutter. And that's something I think we really need to pay attention to. And it's one of the issues I have found with horticulture and landscape design. Those practices is we're not looking at them multifunctionally, and a lot of it is cookie cutter practices. And oftentimes it's because, and it becomes something that's shiny, and we're kind of taught to chase after something that's shiny, or to one up our next door neighbors and so on. And we're not really truly meeting our needs in that process, nor are we benefiting the ecosystem. So,
Sven, excuse me for 1 second.
Sure.
Could you stop the slideshow?
Sure.
So we can, talk to you more directly?
Sven,
Yes.
there's an interesting question about when removing plants or parts of plants for harvest, you'd get bare spots. Do you have favorite strategies for keeping the design attractive throughout harvest cycles?
So we can look at succession planting in that regard. So I would remove a plant, and so we got to keep in mind when we're planting this, and this is one of the issues with the images I was seeing. You've got this row of purple kale or dinosaur kale or something of that nature, and you're going to harvest from that. So some of those you just take leaves off of. You're not taking the entire plant out of the ground. But you are correct that there will be, at some point in time, you're going to be taking all the leaves off that kale plant. So I would be looking at succession planting and seasonality, as well as, if that doesn't fit, then planting the same plant or another one in that spot when it's ready. I would also recommend, especially on the annuals, just cut them off at the root level, at ground level, and leave the roots in the soil, because that's food for the soil. That will break down. And there's some that can be a little bit, some that really want to continue going and will put shoots back out. But most plants, once you've taken all that matter off the top, they pretty much die, and the roots feed the soil. One of the things I was thinking about with these systems is weeding. And weed control definitely plays a role in any type of production system. So wood chips could, as a mulch, do not put them into your soil. Leave them only at top. You can scrape them away. Plant, another kale or something of that nature. But also, like I've mentioned square foot gardening. I've mentioned Rosalind Creasy and I don't remember the other gentleman's name, but looking at all of this material and putting it together. But in this case, I would look at succession planting, because there are a lot of plants that fit into that realm. And so you can even design for that as well. So your garden changes theme over the season or over the growing season. I hope I answered that question correctly or as wished.
Very helpful. Sven, there's a question from Julia Rothenberg. Have you talked with Stephen Barstow, who has a tree forest perennial garden?
I was lucky enough, Eric Tonesmeyer of Perennial Vegetables and Edible Forest Gardens 1 and 2, he reached out to a bunch of us that are connected to him, and he had Stephen Barstow out at Holyoke Community College last fall, or I believe. And I do have his book, Around the World in 80 Plants. I believe he has trialed 3,000 or 4,000 different edible perennials in, I think he's in Sweden. You know, definitely a little cooler than here, but he's along the water. So it's temperatures are managed there. He's got a lot of good information online. He's a vegetarian, so that makes it, I mean, I can understand his drive for having diversity on his plate and in his landscape. So Steve, yeah, Stephen is an interesting fellow.
Okay.
Now, I'm honored to have met and trained under basically everybody that I have trained under. And one of the things, here's something I suggest, and I have thousands of hours or tens of thousands of hours of training. And let's say it's on soil health or it's on apple trees or whatever it may be. I suggest taking courses from different people, but on the same subject. So let's say it's on soil health. I will learn of problems and solutions from multiple angles because we don't all think the same. So one presenter, educator, will look at it from the left, and one will look at it from the right based upon how they have found a problem and then found a solution. So by taking courses from the same course from multiple people, you end up with a broader toolbox or a larger toolbox to get answers from and knowledge from. So when you let's say somebody calls me on an issue and I show up, I basically, because of the way I've planned my education, I'm able to look at things from multiple angles, and I think that's a great tool for others.
Diversity is always a positive thing.
Yes. Can't have enough education.
Can't have enough education. Thank you.
You're welcome. I'm looking at the chat here now.
I think we have time for one more question.
Okay. Okay, I saw the bare spots. I see comfrey in there. Comfrey is a great dynamic accumulator. I see that comment. I see Stephen Barstow. Yep.
There's a question about seaweed as a mulch.
Yeah, somebody mentioned too, putting a container plant in bare spots temporarily. That works fine. The only thing I would say is just pay attention to that plant. The plants that are in the soil, in the ground, are basically all getting generally the same amount of water. But a plant in a container, just like a raised bed, due to the fact that it's above the soil line, will drain faster. So that will have to be watered more often. Seaweed as a mulch, I have not used it as a mulch. I'm actually looking to. I live 10 miles from the center of New Haven, and then it's maybe another 2 miles at the most to the ocean. I might not get seaweed from right here. I'd probably go to more, because we're in the Sound, to more open ocean areas, Rhode Island, and load the truck or whatever. But I do use kelp as a soil amendment. The only thing I don't like about using, and kelp is great. It's basically got every trace mineral in it that plants need. The downfall is you have to till it into the soil, and tilling destroys the architecture of like what lives where in the soil strata. And so, and you can also make like not a compost tea, but make a tea from kelp and pour that on plants. It's a great probably foliar feed. But I do have some kelp in my garage. I'm going to be working with some clients and actually tilling it into the soil. But everything after that, generally kind of side dress the plants with it. Yeah, kelp is great. Probably one of the best plants out there for a garden amendment. Somebody mentions here putting it in a compost pile. That is good too. Definitely get the salt off, rinse the salt off if you're picking up seaweed. Sand, I wouldn't worry about so much, but the salt can cause some serious issues. And there aren't many plants that are edible that are salt tolerant. Because I live near the ocean and or working with projects that are along sidewalks or roads, and we salt our roads here, that really becomes an issue.
Sven, we're asking speakers to give us a list of their books that they think people should look at and resources. So after the conference, please send that to us and we will be making it available to everybody, along with all the other speakers' books and resources.
There was a slide somewhere that had all of that on it. So real quick, it was Rosalind Creasy's Edible Landscaping.
Well, you don't have to do it now,
Okay.
Sven.
Okay.
This is for after.
Okay. I'll send it.
Okay. Thank you so much, Sven.
And thank you for having me. I apologize for the technical difficulties. There was a lot more in here to share different styles. I recommend the books that I mentioned already so that folks get a stronger idea. They don't seem to be that technical. They're very image-based. And I'm hoping that, between companion planting, succession planting, looking at seed catalogs to see what these plants look like as adults, paying attention to sun and shade and water and soil health will provide the best benefits.
Okay. And
Let's go
people who
further.
want some more detail and more of how they might go about it can come to your workshop.
Yes, yeah, that's at 1 o'clock this afternoon.
1:30.
1:30, yes, thank you.
Great. All
Thank you
right.
for having me. Thank you for the questions.
Thank you, Sven.